My grandmother, Evelyn Carter, was the kind of woman who could make anyone feel at home. At 78 years old, she still woke up before sunrise, brewed coffee in the same old kitchen where she had spent most of her life, and walked through the fields of her beloved farm. The farm wasn't just land to her. It was her history. Every fence post had been built by my late grandfather. Every apple tree carried memories of family gatherings, laughter, and holidays spent together. To Grandma, selling the farm would be like erasing an entire lifetime. Unfortunately, my parents saw things differently. For years, my father Mark and my mother Linda had pressured Grandma to sell the property. The farm had become extremely valuable as developers expanded into the area. They saw dollar signs where Grandma saw memories. "Mom, you're getting older," Dad would say during family dinners. "Managing all this land is too much work." Grandma would simply smile and shake her head. "As long as I can walk these fields, I'm staying right here." Those words always irritated my parents. I noticed how their smiles disappeared whenever Grandma refused. I noticed the whispered conversations they thought nobody could hear. I noticed the greed growing in their eyes every year. Still, I never imagined how far they would go. One Friday morning, Dad called Grandma with what sounded like wonderful news. "Mom," he said excitedly, "your cousin Margaret wants to see you. We thought we'd surprise you with a trip." Grandma was thrilled. She hadn't seen her cousin in years. Mom spent days helping her pack. Dad drove her to the airport himself. They hugged her goodbye, smiling and acting like the perfect son and daughter-in-law. At least that's what Grandma believed. The truth was far uglier. 3 hours later, I received a frantic phone call. "Emma," Grandma's voice trembled. "Something's wrong." I immediately sat upright. "What happened?" "The airline says there's no reservation. They can't find my ticket." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "I called your father, but his phone is off. Your mother's phone too." A terrible feeling washed over me. I called Dad, no answer. I called Mom, straight to voicemail, again and again, nothing. Then I drove to their house. When I arrived, their car was sitting in the driveway. My heart sank. If they had dropped Grandma off for a flight, why were they already home? I quietly entered through the unlocked front door. Voices came from the dining room. "We should have the sale finalized within 2 weeks," Dad said. Mom laughed. "By the time she figures anything out, it'll be too late." My blood ran cold. A stack of documents sat on the table. Property records, farm surveys, real estate contracts. Everything suddenly made sense. The trip had never existed. There was no cousin waiting for Grandma, no vacation, no ticket. My parents had abandoned a 78-year-old woman alone at an airport so they could secretly sell the farm she loved. I stood frozen in disbelief. These were the people who raised me, the people Grandma trusted completely. And they had betrayed her in the cruelest way imaginable. My phone rang. "Grandma." I answered immediately. "Sweetheart," she whispered. For the first time in my life, I didn't know how to tell her the truth. Tears filled my eyes as I grabbed my car keys. "Don't worry, Grandma," I said. "I'm coming to get you." As I raced toward the airport, I had no idea that my parents' betrayal was about to start a battle that would change our family forever. When I arrived at the airport, I found Grandma sitting alone near a row of plastic chairs. Her small suitcase rested beside her, and she clutched her purse tightly in her lap. For a moment, my heart broke. She looked so small and lost. This was the same woman who had spent decades taking care of everyone else. The same woman who had worked endless hours beside my grandfather to build the farm from nothing. Yet now she sat alone, abandoned by the very people she loved most. The moment she saw me, relief flooded her face. "Emma." I rushed forward and wrapped my arms around her. "It's okay, Grandma, I'm here." She held me tightly. "Did your father answer?" she asked quietly. I hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. Her shoulders slumped. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Deep down, I think she already knew the truth. The drive back to the farm was silent. Grandma stared out the window while endless fields passed by. I could see tears gathering in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. When we finally reached the farmhouse, she slowly stepped onto the front porch and looked around. The old swing still moved gently in the breeze. The flower garden still bloomed beside the fence. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow everything had changed. That evening we sat together at the kitchen table. Grandma poured 2 cups of tea before finally speaking. "They want the farm." I nodded, yes. She looked down at her hands. For years, I hoped I was imagining it. I remained silent. "After your grandfather died, they started asking questions about ownership, about money, about what would happen when I was gone." Her voice cracked. I thought they were concerned about me. The pain in her eyes was unbearable. They weren't concerned. I said softly, "No." For a long moment, she stared at the family photographs hanging on the wall. Then something surprising happened. A calm expression appeared on her face, almost as if a decision had finally been made. "Emma," she said, "there's something you need to know." She stood and walked toward an old wooden cabinet. From a locked drawer, she removed a thick envelope. The papers inside looked old but carefully preserved. "What is this?" I asked. Grandma sat back down and placed the documents in front of me. "A trust." My eyes widened. "A trust," she nodded. "Your grandfather and I created it years ago." I quickly began reading. The farm wasn't owned solely by Grandma anymore. It was protected by a family trust that required strict conditions before any sale could occur. No single family member could force a sale. No transfer could happen without multiple legal protections. And most importantly, the farm could never be sold against Grandma's wishes. My parents clearly didn't know any of this. A faint smile appeared on Grandma's face. They thought they were clever. I couldn't help smiling, too. "They have no idea, do they?" "No." For the first time all day, a spark returned to her eyes. "But that's not all." She handed me another folder. Inside were copies of letters, financial records, and notes she had kept for years. Evidence, proof of pressure, manipulation, and suspicious attempts by my parents to gain control of the property. I looked up in shock. "You saved all this?" Grandma nodded. "I prayed I would never need it." A determined look crossed her face. "But after what they did today, I think it's time." I reached across the table and took her hand. "What are you going to do?" The sadness in her eyes slowly transformed into strength. For 78 years, Evelyn Carter had been kind, patient, and forgiving. But my parents had finally pushed her too far. "We're going to protect this farm," she said firmly, "and this time we're going to do it properly." At that moment, neither of us knew that the biggest surprise of all was still waiting in a courtroom. The weeks that followed were some of the most stressful of my life. My parents had no idea that Grandma and I knew everything. They continued acting as if nothing had happened. Dad called Grandma several times, pretending to be concerned. "Mom, where are you?" he asked during one phone call. "We've been worried sick." Grandma looked at me before calmly replying, "Really, Mark, that's interesting." Dad immediately changed the subject. The lies only grew worse from there. Meanwhile, Grandma and I met with an attorney named Robert Hayes. After reviewing the trust documents and evidence she had collected over the years, he became very interested. "This is serious," he said. "How serious?" I asked. Robert leaned back in his chair. Your parents appear to have attempted to gain control of property they don't legally own. Grandma remained calm. What happens now? We wait. But waiting didn't take long. A few days later, everything exploded. The real estate company my parents had contacted discovered a legal problem during their investigation. The farm's ownership records revealed the existence of the trust. Suddenly, the sale couldn't move forward. The developers demanded answers, lawyers became involved, then came the shocking discovery. Several documents submitted by my parents contained misleading information about Grandma's intentions and ownership rights. The matter quickly moved into court. The courtroom was packed on the first day. I sat beside Grandma while my parents occupied the opposite side of the room. Dad avoided eye contact. Mom looked angry rather than ashamed. Neither of them appeared sorry for what they had done. When proceedings began, their attorney painted a very different picture. According to their story, they were loving children trying to help an elderly woman manage property she could no longer maintain. They claimed Grandma had wanted to sell. They claimed she had become confused. They even implied she was being manipulated. I felt my hands tighten into fists. Every word was a lie. Then our attorney stood. One by one, he introduced evidence. Phone records, property documents, emails, financial records. The courtroom grew quieter with each revelation. Then came the airport security footage. The video showed my parents dropping Grandma off at the airport. It showed them leaving, and it showed them driving away without ever ensuring she had a ticket, reservation, or destination. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge's expression hardened. Next came my testimony. I described Grandma's phone call. I described finding my parents at home. I described overhearing their conversation about selling the farm. Dad's face turned pale. Mom stared at the table. Then Grandma took the stand. The entire room seemed to listen more carefully. She spoke softly but confidently. She explained how she and Grandpa had built the farm together. She explained years of pressure from my parents. Finally, she revealed the trust documents. The judge carefully reviewed every page. The silence felt endless. Then Grandma delivered one final surprise. I also updated my will last year. She said, both of my parents looked up instantly. The judge adjusted his glasses. And who is the beneficiary? Grandma smiled gently. The person who never abandoned me. I realized she was talking about me. Across the courtroom, my parents looked stunned. Their plan had completely collapsed. The money they expected was slipping away. The farm they tried to steal was no longer within reach. As the hearing ended, the judge announced that a final ruling would be delivered the following week. Everyone slowly left the courtroom, but before leaving, the judge looked directly at my parents. His expression said everything. They had spent months believing they would win. Instead, they had just heard the beginning of their downfall. And the judge's final words were still yet to come. The week before the final hearing felt longer than an entire year. Grandma and I spent most of our time on the farm. We walked through the fields together, fed the animals, and watched the sunsets from the old wooden porch. For the first time since the airport incident, she seemed peaceful, not because the court case was over, but because the truth was finally out. The secrets, the lies, and the betrayal could no longer hide behind fake smiles and family dinners. When the day of the ruling finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. Everyone wanted to hear the outcome. My parents sat quietly at their table. Gone was the confidence they had displayed at the beginning of the case. Their faces looked tense and exhausted. Grandma sat beside me with her hands folded calmly in her lap. The judge entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. Then the room fell completely silent. the judge began reviewing the facts. He spoke about the trust. He spoke about the ownership records. He spoke about the false statements and the evidence presented during the hearings. Each sentence seemed to make my parents sink lower in their seats. Then the judge paused. His gaze moved directly toward them. "In my years on this bench," he said, "I have seen many family disputes involving property and inheritance." The room remained silent. "But this case is not simply about land." His voice grew firmer. "This case concerns trust, responsibility, and the treatment of a vulnerable family member." My father lowered his head. My mother stared at the floor. The judge continued. "The evidence clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Evelyn Carter was intentionally abandoned at an airport while efforts were being made to obtain control of her property." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge struck his gavel once. Silence returned. "The court finds no legal basis for the defendant's claims regarding ownership of the farm." My heart pounded. The attempted sale is declared invalid. Grandma quietly squeezed my hand. Tears filled my eyes. But the judge wasn't finished. The court further recognizes the trust established by Mrs. Carter and her late husband as fully valid and enforceable. Everything my parents had worked toward vanished in a single sentence. Years of greed, months of planning. Every scheme gone. Then came the words nobody expected. Respect for parents and grandparents is not merely a moral obligation. It reflects one's character. The judge looked directly at my parents. The court cannot force love, gratitude, or decency. However, it can prevent individuals from profiting from their own misconduct. The courtroom was completely silent. My parents looked devastated, not because they had lost money, but because everyone now knew exactly what they had done. The ruling ended with legal penalties and repayment of various court costs. But the greatest consequence wasn't financial. It was losing the trust of the one person who had loved them unconditionally. Outside the courthouse, reporters and spectators gathered nearby. Grandma ignored them all. Instead, she turned toward me. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." I immediately hugged her. "No, Grandma, he'd be proud of you." Months later, Grandma officially transferred the future ownership of the farm into a protected family trust with me as its caretaker. Together, we transformed part of the property into a community garden and scholarship program for local students. The farm remained exactly where it belonged, not in the hands of greedy people, but in the hands of those who truly cared about it. As for my parents, they eventually moved away. They lost the fortune they had chased so desperately. Grandma, however, gained something far more valuable: peace. And every evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set over the fields Grandpa once loved, I realized something important. The sweetest revenge was never about destroying those who betrayed you. It was about protecting what they tried to take and proving that kindness, loyalty, and truth are stronger than greed. In the end, Grandma didn't just win the farm. She won justice. And when the judge spoke, everyone finally heard the truth.